Today, we're going to take a look at conjunctive punctuation marks. So, as writers and as potential SAT takers, we are aware that there are conjunctive punctuation marks that we have in our toolbox. There are four of them that the SAT wants us to know: the comma, the semicolon, the colon, and the dash. It's just that we may not exactly know how to always use them. And so, we're going to take a look at each of those over the course of two different videos. Today, we're going to take a look at the semicolon and the colon, and we're going to break them down with using three simple rules for each. I certainly have some other videos that are much more in depth with each of these punctuation marks, but for SAT, I think just simply knowing the basics is plenty. So here we go. So with the semicolon, the first rule says the semicolon as a rule is used between the clauses of a compound sentence if the clauses are not joined by a conjunction. So if you're not going to use a conjunction to join two sentences together like a regular compound sentence, why not use a semicolon? So if I said we didn't want to leave advanced grammar in December, we didn't want to stay either. What's happening is I'm joining two sentences together, and so I'm going to use that semicolon to join them together. But because it's a compound sentence, meaning it's all one big sentence, I'm not going to capitalize that W in we. So it's always lowercase after a semicolon. Remember that. Always lowercase after a semicolon. So sometimes, certainly, sir, the question comes up, why not just use a comma and a conjunction for the compound sentence? Just a good question. So a compound sentence is nice, but it's kind of limited in the conjunctions that you can use to join those two thoughts together. We use a semicolon because it allows us to use the conjunctive adverb, which is much stronger than a traditional conjunction. Sometimes people will be referred to as a transitional word, which is great. It's not officially its word, but it's fine. But really, they're called conjunctive adverbs. So, for example, if I said, with the tightening of the school's budget, the cafeteria has had to make some creative adjustments to the lunch menu. Accordingly, the meatloaf is now mostly sawdust and onion skins. Well, that word accordingly is nice to kind of show the connection between the first sentence and the second sentence, but I can only do that using a semicolon. I also want you to notice that we always put a comma after a conjunctive adverb. Even the simple ones like the word then technically should take a comma after them. The other neat thing about a conjunctive adverb is it can move, so it doesn't always have to be the word in between the two sentences. I can move it from the beginning to the middle to the end. Sorry, from the beginning to the middle to the end. That's great. So if I said, we knew our candidate didn't have a hope of winning. Nevertheless, for weeks on end, we faithfully rang doorbells and stuffed envelopes. The thing is, I can put it here. I can also move it. You'll notice when I move it, the commas travel with it. I can also move it at the end. The thing that's doing all the work is the semicolon. The word nevertheless is just sort of eye candy. It's nice to have, but it's not really doing anything at all. That's why it's not a conjunction. It's an adverb. It's a conjunctive adverb, but it's just an adverb. So really all the heavy lifting is being done by the semicolon. He can't move. But the word nevertheless can move. We can even take it out. It isn't really all that necessary. Rule number 2. A semicolon may be used before for example or for instance, among other phrases. The problem is oftentimes people use for example and for instance, they don't follow it with a full sentence, and that's not correct. If we're going to use a semicolon, it has to be a full sentence on both sides. I'll say that again because that's really important for the SAT. A semicolon has to have a full sentence on both sides. So if I said, for some unknown reason, television executives allow lousy programming to survive well beyond its lifetime. For example, The Bachelor. It's great, except it's not a full sentence after that semicolon. So I need to complete this. So I might say something like, for example, The Bachelor is beginning its 131st season with the same hackneyed premise of rose ceremonies and girl fights and sleazy people. Terrific. Now I have a full sentence on both sides. This happens a lot with for example and for instance, so just make sure you always follow those phrases with complete sentences. The last one's a weirdo, but something to be aware of. So a semicolon actually can be used as what we call sort of a strong comma. What that means is a semicolon can actually separate items in a series if there are already commas. So if I said something like, in order to gain publicity for my man versus food challenge, I met with a photographer from the newspaper, a professor of nutrition, and 7 or 8 enormous linebackers. So really what I have is a listing of photographer, professor, and linebackers. And so these commas here are the regular commas dividing the different items in that series. But what if I added more to it? What if I said I met with a photographer from the newspaper, a professor of nutrition who was retired from Penn State University, and 7 or 8 enormous linebackers from its football team? Now it's a little confusing because now I have this comma here, And now you're like, well, what is this comma doing? Well, it's kind of part of the other section. And so, let's see if I can bring up my little pointer here for you. No, that was the pen, Jeffrey. Let's try this again. If I can just get this to work. There we go. And so I have this comma here, which is the dividing comma. And I have this comma here, which is a dividing comma. But this is an internal comma. So what we do then is we change those into semicolons. We call them strong commas because now they let us know those are the dividers and this is an internal comma. So an internal comma stays internal. The other commas turn into semicolons is what we call strong commas. It's a way of dividing the three items in this list. The other one I want to look at today is the colon. So the colon is, we use the colon to introduce a long quotation, to introduce a matter, any matter very formally. So a colon always points ahead, and that's how we use the colon. So an introduction could be with a word like this or thus or as follows, the following, these words, or in part. And they're all very formal, and that's what we use a colon for, is to formally introduce something after it, but it's pointing forward. So, for example, I could actually follow it with a complete sentence. I could say, the question was this: would you prefer an entire semester of grammar or a punch in the throat? And so, after I kind of introduced the question was this, and then I pose that question, I can use that colon. You'll notice there's a capitalized letter after the colon. And you'll see sometimes it's lowercase after the colon. It's pretty easy. If you use a full sentence, a complete sentence after the colon, you're going to capitalize. And in a sense, it's kind of like a compound sentence, is really what's happening. It's no different from the semicolon or a comma conjunction. You're making a compound sentence. But for whatever reason in grammar, we capitalize the letter after the colon if it is a full sentence. So if I said, when Jenna saw the taco dinner kit on the kitchen counter, Jenna just rolled her eyes. It will be another Taco Tuesday with her mom's soggy tacos. You'll notice once again, I've capitalized this I in the word it because I really have two full sentences. So something to remember with a colon, if you're taking the SAT, is it always has to be a full sentence in front of the colon. Now we're looking at what happens if it's a full sentence also after, but it always has to be a full sentence first. The other option is after the colon, you could also have a fragment. You could say there are really only three ways to pass the killer AP Psych exam: attending the after school study sessions, praying to God, and cheating off the smart kid next to you. Now, if I follow it with a fragment, I'm going to keep it lowercase. So therefore, in front of the colon, it has to always be a full sentence. You should be able to put a period instead of the colon, and it should still make sense. But after the colon, it's kind of a free-for-all. So with the colon, yes, you have two options, either a complete sentence or a fragment. So sometimes the word following the colon will be capitalized, and sometimes it's not. Yes, it is very tight. Rule number 2, if the words are in a list are positives, you can actually use the colon before that list. But if they're not a positives, don't use a colon. Let me show you what I mean. If I said the hobo had two possessions, his banjo and his lucky sponge. Well, in this case, banjo and lucky sponge are positives of the word possessions, and I could say the hobo had two possessions, period. So that's a full sentence, so I can use a colon, and then I can actually have that a positive after the colon. If I said the hobo's two possessions were his banjo and his lucky sponge, that's a full sentence. But sometimes people try putting a colon after that word were. Now think about it. Could you really say the hobo's two possessions were? No, you couldn't just put a period after the word were. So that's not a complete sentence, and therefore there should not be a colon in that sentence at all. And lastly, rule number 3, use a colon to introduce a word or a phrase that you want to emphasize. It's one of the coolest things about the colon. Sometimes people try using a semicolon for this, and that's not correct. It wouldn't ever work. So I said, after a certain time, Latonda holds out her hand and shakes her head with sass. Enough, girlfriend. Well, in this case, it's not a full sentence, no matter what Latonda thinks. So I'm not going to capitalize that E in enough. But it's really cool because it kind of emphasizes a word right after that sentence. So it's perfect for the colon. So those are the 6 rules, 3 for a semicolon and 3 for a colon, that will get you through the SAT.